Sakartvelo, also known as Georgia, is a land of mountains and valleys that flows with shining gold, red wine, hot springs, and more often than not, blood. For a country that remains to this day, the history of the native Georgians stretches all the way back past the Stone Age. Here, the oldest wine on the archaeological record was found, dating to 6000 BC. Here, the tale of the Argonauts reached the Black Sea coast, giving rise to one of the most popular stories from Greek mythology, Jason and the Golden Fleece, thus showcasing the interconnectedness of Georgia to the rest of the world, even during the dawn of the Bronze Age. The Kartvelians, or Georgians, made their home on the Black Sea coast and interior valleys of the Caucasus mountain range. Indeed, these mountains would prove to be the best friend of the Georgians, as the Greater Caucasus shielded them from the likes of nomadic invaders from the Eurasian steppe, and the Lesser Caucasus from the Persians of the Iranian plateau. Not only did the Caucasus Mountains prove to be a cradle for Georgian civilization, but it is also one of the most vital junction points in the world. The Caucasus Range stretches over an isthmus between the Black and Caspian Seas and creates an intersection that completely cuts off every single direction. There are only a few mountain passes that can connect the north to the south. These passes, the Georgians have defended since the start of time. Some may say Constantinople is the bridge between east and west. Then I say Georgia is the intersection where east and west meets north and south. While the Georgians are, and for most of history have been the largest ethnic group in the region, they are far from the only ones to call this land home. The Isthmus of Mountains created something of an island where hundreds of ethnicities and languages would flourish throughout the centuries. Most notable among these various neighbors included, but not limited to the Caucasus Mountain region, include the Armenians, whom the Georgians share a large part of their own history with. Still, there are the Chechens, the Avars of Dagestan, as well as the Circassians, not many of which remain today, Alans, Kurds, and Ossetians, only to name a few. Even still, for much of Georgian history, there has been a split between the Kartvelians. In the central Caucasus, around the city of Kartli, lies the cattle-grazing Iberians, while on the Black Sea coast there are the fishermen and traders known as the Kolchians. Both lands would be part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire until gaining independence after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BC. Hereafter, Iberia and Colchis would ally one another as their first rulers, Pharnavaz of Iberia, married his sister to King Kuji of Colchis. The kingdoms of Iberia and Colchis flourished for a time before eventually becoming a battleground for various Iranian-based empires, steppe nomads, the Diadochi, and eventually the Romans. In the years of chaos, roughly from 100 BC to 500 AD, the Georgians found something that they would never quite let go of. In 337, Iberia, under King Mirian III Chosroid, became the 3rd country in all of world history to convert to Christianity. About 100 years later, the namesake of Georgia, King Vakhtang Gorgasali, split from the Roman Church and created the Georgian Orthodox Church that remains the state religion to this very day. The kingdom of Iberia that he ruled over faced decline until its eventual conquest at the hands of the Sassanid Persian Empire. For the next 300 years, the once mighty kingdom of Iberia would be reduced to a vassal state, ruled over by squabbling princes from a variety of royal families. Eventually, the emerging Abbasid Caliphate would annex the princely state of Iberia in 786, and for the next 30 years it would remain part of the Caliphate. Eventually, in 813, the princedom of Iberia would be revived as a Byzantine March vassal under a new and powerful family called the Bagrat III, who would come to rule Georgia for the next millennium. Along with their Bagratid cousins and allies in Armenia, the two states rose from Abbasid domination to carve out their own nations. While the Bagratid sister branches produced excellent generalship, They were also their own worst enemy, as they quickly fell into open warfare, dividing and fighting over the little land they controlled in Iberia. While the Iberian Bagratids are shuffling for power, other Georgian kingdoms were solidifying their positions on the map. These included the all-powerful Kingdom of Abkhazia, who rose to prominence under their own Anshabadze dynasty. In the east, surrounded by Christian states, was the small yet powerful Emirate of Tbilisi, which would prove to be a thorn in the side of the Bagratids for many years to come. Beyond Tbilisi, there lies two more kingdoms of Kartvelians. Going along the Caucasus Mountains are the Kakhetians and their dynasty of ruling prince-bishops. The farthest east of the Kartvelian kingdoms was Hereti, who long bordered, fought, and integrated with the local Caucasus Albanians in what is now modern-day Azerbaijan. This is the world that a boy named Bagrat would be born into, a world of division that he was to one day unite, where he would lay the foundations for a country that remains 1,000 years after his death and into the present day. Bagrat Bagration was born in 960 AD in the city of Kutaisi, which remains one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth. He was the son of Gurgen, king of kings of the Iberians, and Gorandukt, the daughter of Abkhazia's most powerful, King George II. While Gurgen may have held the title King of Kings of the Iberians, in actuality this could not be farther from the truth. At this time, the Bagration family of Iberia was split between two main power bases: the ruling family of kings and a supposedly less powerful dynasty of princes who ruled from the western province of Tau. While the princes of Tau were technically under the suzerainty of the Kingdom of Iberia, they held much more autonomy than was suggested by their rank. In fact, it can be said the most powerful Bagration at this time was not even King Gurgen, but his cousin, Prince David III of Tau. Prince David, widely regarded as David the Great, was a highly energetic figure. Over the course of his 34 years as prince, he was arguably the most powerful and certainly the most influential man in the Caucasus Mountain region, garnering support from his Bagratid brothers in both Armenia and Iberia. He walked a fine line between vassal and overlord, as the Byzantine Empire had bestowed him with the title of Choropolates of Iberia, a highly prestigious rank which marked out Prince David as a respected individual and an important ally in the eyes of the Eastern Romans. By naming the Prince of Tau as the Choropolates, this created a very awkward situation for both King Gurgen and Prince David. In the eyes of the Byzantines, David was the leading Bagration, while in the lineage of Iberia, he was supposed to be a mere prince of a peripheral province. The Byzantine sponsorship of Prince David would lead him to become the real power behind the throne of Gurgen. David never attempted to overthrow his kingly cousin, but he did flip the cards on him and turn him from being his overlord to being his vassal in all but name. Now, with all of Iberia at his disposal, David the Great would conduct the military campaigns that would one day solidify his influence over Georgia and beyond. While Prince David would win many a battle, his greatest triumph was not in the field, but in his big picture for the future. David would have no children of his own, but he adopted wisely. Soon after Bagrat was born in 960, Prince David adopted him as his own son, thereby making Bagrat the inheritor of not only Iberia but also the princely offshoot of Tau. At a young age, Bagrat was set to end the power squabbling that the Bagratids of Iberia and Tau had been fighting for decades. In 976, the Prince Bishop of Kakheti, Kavirake II, invaded his long-term rival in Abkhazia. He captured the city carved into and through a mountain called Uplisike, which translated to the Lord's Fortress. With no response from the king of Abkhazia, Kivrake set up a strong base camp in the rock-hewn fortress. While Abkhazia may look as if it was giving up on their burgeoning kingdom, Prince David of Tau looked at an opportunity to begin the cementing of his plans. David the Kuropalate, King Gurgen of Iberia, and the young Bagrat marched on Oplisike, interfering in a war that they had absolutely no business being in. The Iberians marched through Abkhazia and sent the Kakhetians running, expelling them from the region of Kartli and recovering Oplisike. Instead of kindly returning the land to the king of Abkhazia, David of Tau chose to give the land to one of Abkhazia's possible heirs. Bagrat was installed as Duke of Kartli at only 16 years old, although he still was under the regency of his two fathers, showing that the true defender of Abkhazia was not its old, blind, and sorrowed King Theodosius. Instead, it was his nephew, Bagrat, the possible inheritor of both Abkhazia and Iberia. With Duke Bagrat of Kartli settling into his new palace, it didn't take long for Kivrake the Kakhetian to return. The Kakhetian army took Bagrat and his advisors by surprise. The young and exceedingly important Bagrat was captured by Prince Bishop Kivrake. With the most important teenager in Georgia as a hostage, one may expect this to make Gurgen and David, Bagrat's biological and adoptive father, to take a safe approach in recovering their heir apparent. Instead, the prince and his king assembled their armies to retake Bagrat and Kartli by force. David and Gurgen retook Oplisike and sent the Kakhetians fleeing once again. Soon after, Kivrake gave up on his ambitions in Kartli and agreed to release Bagrat after being paid a massive sum of gold. Gold that Kivrake would never get to use, as he died soon after the release of the young Bagratid Duke. His youngest son, whose name was also David, became the new Prince Bishop of Kakheti. With Bagrat's place as Duke of Kartli restored, the time to swipe Abkhazia was finally open for Prince David. By 978, the last remaining brother of Bagrat's mother, Theodosius III, sat on the Abkhazian throne as the last remaining male member of the Anshabadzi dynasty, who had ruled over this land for more than 200 years. Theodosius was a weak, blind, and sorrowed king who plotted against his older brothers when they were the king, leaving him to be blinded, exiled, and disgraced on multiple occasions. It's safe to say that the Abkhazians did not like their king. They already started looking towards the future, just as Prince David had foresaw. Abkhazia was to be inherited by Bagrat, eventually, and he already ruled in Kartli. Why not just replace the weak and sorrowed Theodosius with a young duke who has powerful allies? The Bagrationi had intermarried a few times into the line of Anshabadzi kings, giving them a place that they already had carved out in the Abkhazian court. With this power base, David of Tau leveraged the nobility to overthrow the old, blind, and sorrowed Theodosius, exiling him for the final time. The ruling Anshabadzi dynasty faded along with him, as he is never heard from again. With the Abkhazian king deposed, there were only two possible claimants to the throne. That was, of course, Bagrat, but possibly his mother. Garandukt was the last living member of the ruling Anshabadzi dynasty. She could have claimed Abkhazia as her rightful inheritance, but chose to give it to her 18-year-old son, who was already set to unify nearly all of the Kartvelians. In 978, Bagrat, the Duke of Kartli, became the King of Abkhazia, creating the quadruple alliance of Bagratid Iberia, Armenia, Tau, and now Abkhazia. The early Bagratid family was inheriting land like they were a natural Habsburg. Despite being 18, Bagrat was still under the regency of King Gurgen, Queen Garandukt, and David of Tau, all of the people who Bagrat was set to inherit land from. The Regency trio was finally dismantled in 980, after Bagrat's 20th birthday. Hereafter, he ruled as a well-intentioned king and was widely regarded as a fair but practical ruler, who attempted to centralize all power onto himself, just as his family centralized all inheritance onto him. The Abkhazia that Bagrat began ruling was a strong realm with the majority of the rich coastal territory in Georgia. But Abkhazia had already passed its precipice under Bagrat's grandfather, King George II. In the years following his death, his sons bickered and the nobles split amongst them. King Bagrat would spend a large portion of his early reign hemming in these nobles by force or promotion. By the time Bagrat was nearing his 30th birthday, there was only a few opponents left in his court, that being his Bagratid cousins who still held ducal roles, and Duke Rati the Lip-Tarid. Rati was the Duke of Klidikari, the land directly south of Kartli. He had been a thorn in the side of Bagrat during his short stint as Duke of Kartli, and before that, while he was one of King Gurgen's next-door neighbors. In 989, King Gurgen decided to finally put an end to the troublesome Duke Rati. He assembled an army and marched there, but he had failed to mention this campaign to his Prince of Tau. David saw this as an attempted overthrow by King Gurgen. Without hesitation, acquired from years of constant inter-family feuds, David the Kuropalates marched on Kartli and utterly annihilated the army of his king. The conditioning of a childhood spent in the midst of a Bagrationi family that killed each other at a moment's notice forced Prince David to act quickly when he sensed a threat from his hostage and allied king. He had failed to ask Gurgen or Bagrat of their intentions. They both told Prince Cousin David that they were only and truthfully after Duke Rati. After annihilating a whole army of his fellow Kartvelian countrymen and nearly starting a war, Prince David learned of his error and released the loyal King Gurgen. Hereafter, the Duke of Lower Kartli's lands were inherited by who else but King Bagrat of Abkhazia. With the loyalty of his two kings reconfirmed, Prince David soon made plans to enlarge his own personal realm. Looking south was the exposed and isolated emirate of Diyarbakir, as well as the much smaller Kurdish emirate located north of Lake Van, that separated King Gagik of Armenia from his allies in Tau and Iberia. The Bagratids of Tau and Armenia used both of their Kurdish emirates to enlarge their own realms, with Prince David taking all the land of the Lake Van emirate and King Gagik claiming nearly half of Diyarbakir as part of Armenia. In the years following this successful campaign, all four Bagratid kingdoms would unite to attack the Emirate of Tbilisi. The city itself had been captured and looted by the Bagrationi many years ago, although the Emirate always found a way to spring back up in the ashes and hot springs of the city. In 997, the four Bagratids, led by the only prince among them, besieged Tbilisi. The siege lasted only a few months before it became clear that it was not yet time for Tbilisi to be reclaimed by the Georgians. In 999, the masterpiece of Bagrat's reign as King of Abkhazia was completed. Bedia Cathedral. Although the spire of the church has fallen off, Bedia still stands to this day, housing the man who had built it in its catacombs. A year later, as the millennium turned to 1000, Prince David Kuropalates sipped on communion wine. The now 70-year-old Bagratid faction leader started walking down the aisle, before dropping dead, poisoned by his own nobles with communion wine. Bagrat, the adopted son of Prince David, was set to inherit the entirety of Tau, but would only keep one of David the Great's possessions. Since 987, Prince David had adopted another son, who just so happened to be the Byzantine Emperor, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. David had made the mistake of supporting one of Basil's rivals. After the Bulgar Slayer slew David's armies, he forced the Prince of Tau to adopt him and promise all of his land to the Byzantine Empire, just as he had promised it to Bagrat. The death of David meant that Bagrat and Basil were set to inherit the same land, and no one got in the way of the spicy Bulgar Slayer. Basil, upon learning of his Kuropalate's death, arrived in Tau and started claiming the land as his own, using his army to lift the Georgian guards and soldiery in a mostly peaceful manner. Tau fell, with only one conflict occurring over that time: a riot that had broken out when a Georgian soldier refused to let go of a bale of hay that he owned. A Byzantine Varangian guardsman grew angry with him and stabbed him, causing a chain reaction that would result in the Varangians going full Viking mode and plundering a small town. Basil had added a sizable chunk to his eastern border, including a field that would prove to ruin the Byzantine Empire, a place called Manzikert. Despite depriving Tau from Bagrat, he did agree to meet with the king of Abkhazia and his father in Iberia. In an attempt to maintain a Georgian ally in the Caucasus, Emperor Basil endowed upon King Bagrat the title of Kuropalates of Iberia. Seeking to cause interference between father and son, Basil gave King Gurgen the less prestigious title of Magistros. However, this only served to strengthen the relationship between Gurgen and Bagrat, as they now both feared what might happen if Basil decided to keep stealing inheritances. In 1001, King Gurgen of Iberia, finally freed from his princely overlord, took the initiative and assembled an army to conquer Tau in his son's name. The king of Iberia was forced to face one of the Byzantine's finest generals, Nicephorus Uranus. Over the course of 2 years, Gurgen gained very little headway in Tau and was defeated on multiple occasions. By 1002, Gurgen withdrew and signed a peace treaty with the Byzantine Empire. In this year of defeat, there would still be a victory. King Gurgen would see the birth of his first and possibly only grandson. He would happen to share the name with the country that Bagrat would create. His name was George, or in his native tongue, Georgi. Bagrat may have had another son, who he would name Basil. This, however, has not been proven. All that we know about this Basil is that he was a Bagrationi who joined the clergy, leaving him out of the political scene regardless of who his father might have been. A year after the birth of Georgi in 1002, Bagrat Cathedral would be finished. This Georgian Orthodox masterpiece was restored recently and before that was considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The most striking thing about Bagrat Cathedral was that it was built in the hometown of King Bagrat, good old Kutaisi. For the next 5 years, the father and son dual kings ruled their respective realms, who neared closer together the older Gurgen grew. Eventually in 1008, King Gurgen died, and just as planned, by the will of his ambitious prince, his only son, Bagrat became the king of Abkhazia and Iberia. And for the first time in history, eastern and western Georgia were unified into one kingdom, the Kingdom of Georgia. After what could potentially be hundreds of thousands of years, most of the Kartvelians were now under the domain of their very own nation. While Abkhazia and Iberia were by far the most prosperous of the Georgian kingdoms, there were still 2 Kartvelian kingdoms deep in the mountains to the east: the bishopric princes of Kakheti and the frontier kingdom of Hereti. One of Bagrat's first actions as the first king of Georgia was to unify the rest of the Kartvelians by means of conquest. The first in his path was the son of the Kakhetian king, who had captured Bagrat when he was only a helpless 17-year-old Duke of Kartli. The eager King of Georgia was lured into Kakheti and ambushed by the Prince Bishop. Bagrat's first campaign on his own would see him fleeing from Kakheti in defeat. The eastern Kartvelians would remain separate from their western neighbors, for the time being, that is. In 1010, King Bagrat made a controversial decision to imprison his cousins. These two brothers were of a ducal branch of the Bagratid family who had ruled the region of Klarjeti. In terms of the newly created Georgian throne, they were next in line past the young Prince George, and they were much older than their future monarch. The Bagrat the Unifier family had only just healed from decades of bloodshed with the beginning of Bagrat's life. There was no way he was going to let history repeat. The Klarjeti Bagratids would spend their lives imprisoned until they mysteriously died only 2 years later in 1012. Bagrat may have done it in a terrible manner, but he had just completely centralized all Georgian Bagrationi possessions onto himself, creating a strong central authority at the core of the newly created Kingdom of Georgia. This would prove to benefit the Georgian monarchs for many, many years to come. After dooming his Bagratid cousins to a short life behind bars, Bagrat took a second jab at Kakheti. This time he was able to conquer the pesky Prince Bishopric before moving on to Hereti. Here the Kartvelians were few, as this was the frontier of land inhabited by them. Indeed, the Kartvelians were not yet alone here either. Despite this, King Bagrat conquered Hereti and unified all of the Kartvelian kingdoms under himself, becoming perhaps the most powerful Georgian ever born up until that point. The only thing missing from a 100% unified Georgia was the stubborn Emirate of Tbilisi, a rival that would prove a long-time roadblock in utter Bagratid dominance over the Caucasus Mountain region. Shortly after taking the lands of Kakheti and Hereti, the Kurds and Caucasus Albanians took their turns raiding into Hereti. Allying himself with his cousin, King Gagik of Armenia, just as he and David of Tau had, in a short time, they managed to capture the surrender of a few Kurdish towns. The campaign, although going smoothly, would be forced to a halt, as the Prince of Kakheti had returned from his exile. Prince Bishop David of Kakheti managed to inspire rebellion not only in his native Kakheti, but also in Hereti, creating a rival on near equal footing as King Bagrat. Bagrat veered his army around and retook Kakheti from the Prince Bishop. David withdrew all of his forces to Hereti, giving this land of mountain fortresses the proper garrison it needed to hold off the Unifier. Bagrat tried to retake Hereti, but he failed to do so. Prince Bishop David did not get to enjoy his victory for long before dying in the same year that he returned to the throne. David's successor would reclaim the lost glory of their family and much more. In 1014, the last of Bagrat's 3 great cathedrals was finished. Unlike the previous 2, Nikortsminda Cathedral is one of the most well-preserved traditional churches in Georgia. The time couldn't have been better for Bagrat, as shortly after he opened his 3rd grand church, the Unifier of Georgia passed away at the age of only 52 years old. He would leave the newly created Georgia in the hands of his 12-year-old son, the now King George of Georgia. King Bagrat III of Georgia was buried in the first church that he had opened at Bedia, where he supposedly remains to this day. In 2016, over 1,000 years after his death, the long overdue canonization of the first king of Georgia took place. The feast day of Saint Bagrat is on December 22nd. Perhaps Bagrat's legacy is the most important thing about him. He was the first king of Georgia, a country that still exists 1,000 years into the future. Bagrat is the founding father of Georgia, but he couldn't have done it if he was not born at exactly the right place and time. If not for Prince David of Tau, Bagrat may never be Kuropalates. Without his father, he would never be king of Iberia. Without his mother, he would never be king of Abkhazia. And without Bagrat, then who knows if or when Georgia may have formed as a united nation of Kartvelians. The most interesting part of Bagrat's story is everyone's willingness to give him land, even before the highly capable Bagrat could even speak. The Bagrationi and the split kingdoms of Georgia were tired of fighting one another. Bagrat was their answer to finally have peace in the West Caucasus. Although he did unify Georgia, it should be noted that Bagrat did not hold all of what was traditionally considered Georgian lands. He never captured Tbilisi, and Hereti eluded him after he temporarily conquered the region. While he didn't unify every last bit of it, he certainly laid the building blocks for his descendants to complete his work. Now, it was up to his 12-year-old son to make the most of it. If you want to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month and join Derek Clark, Savaclio Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Matevoisian, Lazarus Dikos, and Dave J. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again and Donald Vincent. Thanks again for supporting the channel and a warm welcome to my brand new patrons. I really appreciate you guys.